Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. This week, since Thanksgiving is approaching in just a few days, I thought it appropriate to take on the question of whether Mormons should be abstaining from meat. What do the scriptures actually say on the topic? Of course, many of us are preparing for a large feast with family and friends centered around the epic Thanksgiving meal, traditionally involving a whole lot of turkey. Now, there's kind of a chasm, I believe, between what the scriptures say. There's a big maybe question mark right there that we're going to poke at and get into. So what do the scriptures actually say regarding meat consumption versus what we actually do with all of our barbecues and meat and, most dinner meals? So let's get into what first the scriptures say on the topic. Let's begin starting in 1830, Joseph's inspired translation of the Bible, where he took on Genesis 9 and revised 11, verse 11 to say, "And surely blood shall not be shed only for meat, to save your lives, and the blood of every beast will I require at your hand." All right, so that's interesting, right? Don't shed any blood except for meat. Don't kill for, sport. If you're not using it for meat, don't do this recreationally or whatever, right? This is meant to save your lives. This is a revision that Joseph makes here. The blood of every beast will I require at your hand. It's clear here from this verse to me that the Lord is saying that, animals should not be killed unless absolutely necessary to save your lives, and only for their meat. So that's interesting. That's the first kind of revision we get from Joseph Smith regarding a cultural environment in which, in the early kind of frontier and early America, there was certainly killing for meat. There was killing for sport and recreation. There was killing, some animals were considered pests. There was a lot of spoiled, carcasses on the countryside. There was just much less care for animals, domesticated, wild, et cetera, et cetera. So there was kind of a cultural attitude regarding the use of animals. Many species were, on the verge of extinction. They were being kind of hunted all over the place. And so that was the cultural situation, the environmental situation in which the saints were when Joseph Smith first did this in 1830 with Genesis chapter 9. Following year, in 1831, is when we get the revelation now contained in section 49, which says in part, "And whoso forbiddeth to abstain from meats, that man should not eat the same, is not ordained of God. For behold, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air, and that which cometh of the earth, is ordained for the use of man for food and for raiment, and that he might have in abundance. But it is not given that one man should possess that which is above another, wherefore the world lieth in sin, and woe be unto man that sheddeth blood, or that wasteth flesh, and hath no need." Again, here the Lord is centering the use of animals around the concept of what one actually needs. Interestingly, that's tied still to this idea of that he might have in abundance. This is not a scarcity thing. The Lord hath provided all of these things to use with prudence and thanksgiving, as we'll get into, right? You shouldn't forbid others from abstaining. There were people at the time, there are people now saying, don't eat any animals at all, that's bad. So here the Lord is clarifying, no, that's kind of excess and extreme. You shouldn't forbid completely from abstaining from meat. These things are ordained for the use of man, not just for food, but also raiment, clothing. They're provided in abundance. But, and then the warning is that, woe be unto whoever is shedding blood, killing animals, wasting their flesh without having any need to do so. All right, so that is 1831 in Kirtland. 2 years later, we get in 1833, section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This is the word of wisdom, which says in part, starting in verse 12, "Yea, flesh also of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I, the Lord, have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or famine." All right, so you'll recall from section 49, the previous revelation, it was talking about using meat. It's ordained for the use of man. Use it with thanksgiving. So that's repeated here 2 years later in the word of wisdom. However, there's an additional constraint added in, this question of nevertheless they are to be used sparingly. So let's unpack that. We'll later get into this question of they should only be used in times of, or should not be used only in times of winter and so forth. So first, let's dig into what does it mean to use sparingly. As with many of the revelations, we want to turn to the 1828 Noah Webster dictionary, which shows the kind of vernacular of the time, the way that these words were understood in the era in which they were being utilized in the Revelations. So the definition of sparingly in that dictionary is the following. Number one, not abundantly, which is kind of interesting because the Lord says, here in abundance, and then don't use it abundantly. Okay, number two, frugally, parsimoniously, not lavishly. And number three, abstinently, moderately. So all of these, of course, are intertwined. Thus, the idea that nevertheless they are to be used sparingly suggests don't use it frequently. Be frugal. Don't be lavish, right? Use in moderation. Okay, so that is the definition of sparingly. Interestingly, other than this reference in section 89, the word sparingly appears only once in all of Scripture. It comes from the New Testament in 2 Corinthians 9, where it says, but this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. So in modern revelation and works through Joseph Smith, we get sparingly only in the context of section 89. So then I thought, well, what about General Conference? What have leaders of the church said over time when referencing this verse? How are they talking about what is sparingly? How do we give context to that? Is there any type of, characterization or clarification from general authorities of the church? There were like 5 references, talks that have been given throughout church history where this verse is cited. There were only 2 of any substance, though. The first comes from 1948, Elder Joseph Merrill, who was in the Quorum of the 12 at the time. He said the following, Latter-day Saints, why should you complain of the scarcity or high price of flesh foods? Have you not known that in any case you should eat them sparingly? The Lord told you so. I have quoted from some of the highest authorities in the world to the effect that they are not essential to your physical well-being. But Americans did not know this until God revealed it to them through his prophet Joseph Smith. And now I sum up. Proteins are the building materials of the body, the needed amount of which is largely determined by age and the kind of physical activity. But for the average adult, it is about 10% of food intake. More than this should be avoided. Meat is the richest source of proteins, but sizable amounts are found in the excellent foods, eggs, milk, cheese, beans, nuts, wheat, and more or less in other cereals, vegetables, and fruits. Americans eat too much meat, a non-essential in human diet, because all the proteins needed are available in the other foods just named. So, he says, now I sum up, right? And that's because previously in the talk, he's kind of getting into this more detailed kind of health analysis in an effort to point out why, meat should in fact be used sparingly and is not required to be consumed so heavily. So this was again, 1948, but a very kind of, I don't know if practical is the right word, but kind of a direct, nitpicky kind of approach looking at the word of wisdom in particular at this set of verses about meat itself. We have to go forward about almost half a century to Ezra Taft Benson, 1983, for the other substantive reference where he simply says, I have often felt that the Lord is further counseling us in this revelation against indiscriminately killing animals. Okay, so then you might say, well, what does it mean to indiscriminately kill? Because if it's if it's raised, on a farm and for the sole purpose of meat, and then we're using it all up, is that really, indiscriminate? Clearly, you don't want to just go around and hunt for sport and just, leave these animals to rot. One could argue that if you're even doing that, then other animals will come feed on it and the circle of life will go round, right? But what about this idea that, we looked at sparingly, and okay, that means don't use it frequently, and use it in moderation. So that's how we can kind of contextualize the word sparingly, even if it's not remarked upon by our church leaders in any abundant fashion. But it kind of makes sense. It's intuitive. What does sparingly mean? But what about this question about meat should not be used only in times of winter and so forth? So again, that comes from the word of wisdom, from verse 13. It is pleasing unto me that they, these animals, should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. Now, please note that comma, they should not be used, comma, only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. Now, did you know that that comma has not always been there? This is the subject of some amount of controversy when Latter-day Saints really dig into trying to understand what has the Lord said regarding the consumption of meat. So let's review a little bit of the history, when this comma came into existence, and then what does it mean, or does it even mean anything? Let's begin first with the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, this one from Kirtland. And here you can see they grouped the verses much differently back then, but you can see the highlighted portion. It is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. No comma. They should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. Let's go forward to the next edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. This is the Nauvoo edition in 1844. Here is an image, again from the Joseph Smith papers like the last one, and you can see it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. No comma. So we've established that in the 1835 edition and in the 1844 edition, there is no comma in the revelation regarding this little portion of the verse. Let's now fast forward to 1876. This is the edition of the Doctrine and Covenants prepared by Orson Pratt under the direction of Brigham Young. This is the one, for those of you clued in, right, where they remove the previous section on marriage without common consent or real awareness of the members, which said marriage is between a man and a woman, right? And they put in the polygamy revelation and all of that. This is the version where they're making these changes, 1876. Here is the portion where they've now broken up the verses a bit more, and you can see should not be used only in times of winter. The 1876 edition also lacks a comma. And so then we go to the 1921 edition. This is produced by a committee of apostles. This is the one in which the lectures of faith get removed. And here you can see, it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used, comma, only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. Comma, should not be used, only in times of, there's a comma inserted. So there has been, when I was kind of digging in, what are people saying about this online? What articles have been written? What have scholars said? Blah, blah, blah. There was quite a number of people I encountered who were finger pointing at this edition of the Doctrine and Covenants as making what was characterized as a monumental change, one that changes the meaning of the revelation to insert that comma. In fact, so much consternation exists around this that I saw one scholar call this the errant comma theory. So it has a name, apparently. And it's of no unimportance, because the allegation is that this fundamentally changes the meaning of the revelation. Without a comma, you could read it as saying, you would read it as saying, it is pleasing unto me that animals should not be used only in times of winter, cold, or famine, right? Or in other words, I, the Lord, am pleased if you aren't limiting your use of animals only to when it's cold. That is how some people read the original revelation, absent the comma. It's pleasing unto me that you're not, right? Because he said, use it in abundance, and it's ordained for the use of man. So the people who interpret it this way, the original non-comma revelation, they interpret it as, it is pleasing unto me that you are not only using them in times of cold and famine and so forth. Whereas with a comma inserted, right, it's pleasing unto me that animals, basically flip it, should only be used in times of winter or of cold or of famine. Okay, so I've seen many people online identify this as like a century later change, right? Because we get in 1833 and then 1921 is when it's changed. And it flipped the meaning, and there's all these allegations pointing the finger, as I said, to this particular change in 1921. Here's what one apologist I found, and I think it was the Interpreter, like a scholarly publication, pushing back on this. Here's what that individual said. In short, the comma added in 1921 did not change the meaning of the verse. Church leaders have always read the word only to mean except, with or without the comma. However, the meaning of the word only changed over time, making the added comma useful to helping modern readers retain the original sense of that word. Okay, so this scholar is making the argument that the original revelation, you could have swapped in the word except for only. So it could have read, "It is pleasing unto me that animals should not be used except in times of winter or cold or famine." So this person wrote a whole article about it and makes the case based on kind of the Victorian English of the time that using only and with the comma, right, and the negative should not be used only, comma, only in time, right? The argument is that that's the fancy way of just saying how we today would say except. These should not be used except in times of winter. Therefore, again, according to this argument, adding the comma in 1921 helped retain the original meaning back when the word only meant more except, right? And so adding the comma just clarifies that meaning a little bit. Of course, they could have just, changed it to except or whatever, but they added in a comma. There's one big problem with the errant comma theory. I have seen no one talk about this online. I've seen nobody in any of the scholarly journals point this out. I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm not saying I'm the first to discover it, though that perhaps may be true. I don't know. I just couldn't find a single soul in all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of articles and scholarly papers and stuff highlighting what I'm about to show you. Again, I might have missed it. If you know of anyone else pointing out what I'm about to share with you, I would love to see it. Please share. Okay, here's the issue. I have seen people share the Hiram Smith talk in 1842, and for other reasons, where I'll share a little bit later. Hiram is giving his interpretation, or at least, that is the transcribed version we have of what Hiram is purported to have said. And so I've seen people share this, but I haven't seen people identify what I'm about to show you. So here from, again, the Joseph Smith Papers is the Times and Seasons publication from June 1st, 1852, from a record of a talk that Hiram gave some days prior, sometime in May. And here you can see Hiram quoting from the Revelation, right? "It's pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine." There is no comma. This is 1842. One would think that this is consistent, again, with the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and then the 1844, which comes just 2 years later. They're working on it at the time that Hiram is talking about it in 1842, or at least getting ready. I think they started in 1843, but so that's 1844, just 2 years after Hiram gives this remark. 1876, there's still no comma. So you'd say, okay, well, of course, Hiram in the Times and Seasons, the retelling of that revelation as Hiram is reading it out, and then it's being transcribed for publication in the Times and Seasons, of course it would not have a comma, because that is what is consistent with the 1835, 1844, and 1876 editions of the Doctrine and Covenants. And you would be correct in concluding that that consistency is reflective of how these verses were being used for years and decades, if what I'm about to show you now did not exist. That same talk from Hiram Smith, printed in the Times and Seasons from his May 1842 address, it gets published June 1st, 1842. Several months later, that talk is printed in the Millennial Star. It's a republication in a different periodical for church members. And as you can see here, in October 1842, in the Millennial Star, there is a comma. "It is pleasing unto me that they should not be used, comma, only in times of winter or of cold or of famine." Interesting. So much for the 1921 theory. Now, why there's a discrepancy between the two when it's the same exact discourse, don't know. Why, if they're introducing a comma, perhaps to add emphasis or clarify meaning, that wasn't done for the 1844 and 1876, which came after this, I don't know. But it is evidence of a pre-1921 comma being used in precisely the place where it is inserted in 1921. Again, interesting. However, I don't know that the errant comma theory matters as much as its proponents claim. Whether the comma changed meaning or should not have been there, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I don't see why it causes the consternation that it does, primarily because of the verses immediately following this in the Word of Wisdom in section 89. So let's continue where we left off. All grain is ordained for the use of man and of beasts to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. And these hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess of hunger. Okay, the these that's being referenced in verse 15, these hath God ordained or made for the use of man, are in specific reference to what was just described right before it, the beasts of the field, the fowls of the heaven, and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. And these, all these animals, hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess of hunger. There are no commas here. There are no comma changes here. There are no differences across different editions of the Doctrine and Covenants. So it is indisputed, regardless of your position on the errant comma theory and the 1921 change, that the subsequent verses in the very same revelation double down on the, I think, kind of clear meaning, right? Especially if you interpret the original to use except instead of only. It's pleasing unto me that they should not be used except in times of cold and famine and winter and so forth. So if you take that, I think, plain language reading, if you understand how that Victorian only with the negative, the should not, right? If you throw in the word except to make it make more sense in our modern English, all of this is resolved by verses 14 and 15. These hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess of hunger. That's a positive use. It's not a should not, comma. It's an affirmative. These, God has made these only, right, in times for use only in times of famine and excess of hunger. Now, what about the times of cold, right? The times of famine, the times of winter? Because again, the Revelation says, it's pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. What does that mean? I think the straightforward interpretation is, don't eat meat except for when it's in times of winter or times of cold or times of famine. That's just kind of and there's various like branches of interpretation off of that. It's like, oh, well, they didn't have refrigeration that well back then, and so it was a issue of like not spoiling meat. But in our modern era, we have refrigeration and preservation, and so that's just antiquated, right? And that's like one of the ways that Mormons completely sidestep these verses on meat and feel like, oh, it was reasonable for the time, not admitting the fact that they had several ways of preserving meat, and it wasn't just like going bad and spoiling. And that's why the Lord said, only use meat when it's, cold and you can freeze it because it's so cold outside, right? No. But there's all these like offshoot interpretations or justifications and argumentation to say why the Lord put in here times of winter or of cold or of famine, right? And on both sides of the argument, those who say, nothing to see here, and those who say, we should not be eating nearly as much meat or any meat at all. Here's from that same scholar I mentioned before. I thought this paragraph was appropriate. But even this literalist interpretation that I was referring to becomes complicated when we consider the meaning of times of winter, cold, and famine, with quotes around all of those. Quote, famine might be the easiest to interpret, as it is intuitively clear why God would sanction the use of meat during periods when his children are threatened by starvation. But what definition of winter does this verse refer to? Is winter defined by the meteorologists, the calendar, or the weather? The average temperature of this winter season varies widely across the globe, from comfortably mild and even warm to bitter cold. Some countries are never cold and thus never experience winter at all. With modern heating in homes and cars, do people with these commonplace comforts truly experience winter? If it is cold outside, but we are in well-heated homes and offices, is it a time of cold for us? What is the difference between winter or cold and times of winter or cold? I thought this is from like an apologist, right? This is from a faithful scholar trying to like suss out the different arguments. And she says, I think it was a she. I don't remember the author's name. I didn't write it down, but at the beginning of the article, it's like, oh, I'm not attempting to like answer anything. I just want to like show all the different arguments, and clearly, like, we need more prophetic direction, right? That's how the article was introed. But clearly, like, this is a little confusing, right? Like, what is it if the Lord is saying, here's this meat, it's been ordained for your use it with gratitude and moderation and sparingly and all the rest, right? But I've given it unto you, and it's pleasing unto me that you only use it, right, if it's in a time of winter or of cold or famine. One would think that we might better understand what this means. One would think that in general conference or something, there would be a more like particular clarification, and there would be cultural awareness in the church of what this means. And there's frankly not. I mean, these verses are just completely overlooked when talking about the word of wisdom. At no point in any temple recommend interview has any bishop or stake president that I've ever heard about drill down on this fact. Of course, it's left up to you to just say yes or no, but the way we collectively interpret the word of wisdom, it's like, well, I don't do drugs and I don't drink tea and coffee, therefore I'm okay, right? When the word of wisdom has so much more in it than just that. Selective interpretation, selective obedience, right? We pay attention to the scriptures that make sense. We ignore the ones that are inconvenient or confusing or countercultural. Let's conclude with a few thoughts. Let's maybe start by going back to Hiram's speech. After reading the relevant verses that I cited, where one of his versions had a comma and the other did not, here's what Hiram says. Let men attend to these instructions. Let them use the things ordained of God. Let them be sparing of the life of animals. It is pleasing, saith the Lord, that flesh be used only in times of winter or of famine. And why to be used in famine? Because all domesticated animals would naturally die, and may as well be made use of by man as not. And then he continues. Now, that's kind of interesting. I mean, Hiram did not envision industrialized animal operations. He was interpreting this in the context of their then domestication and what that looked like in their culture and environment. But my heavens, like, it's a different world today where animals are raised en masse for the sole purpose of food production. It's a very different world. One wonders what Hiram and certainly Joseph would say about this if they were here to see it. I also find it interesting that in that little quote inside of his quote where he references the verse, he changes the words a little bit. He says it is pleasing, saith the Lord, that flesh be used only in times of winter or of famine. Number one, he left out cold. But number two, he flipped the negative to a positive. Remember that in the verse it says should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. But here Hiram is saying it is pleasing that flesh be used only in times of winter or a famine. It's almost like he's converting a double negative into the positive, right? Kind of interesting how he's, that even I think suggests the need for the comma to clarify that, which gets added later in 1921. It also gets added in this second version in 1842 of Hiram's speech. I also find it interesting from Hiram's talk that he connected the word sparingly, or at least seems to connect the word sparingly to be sparing of the life of animals, right? Kind of makes sense if we go back to that Webster definition, doing it in moderation and so forth. The implication being we're killing fewer animals. Hiram is saying, let's be sparing of the life of animals. I decided to omit it, but there's, a couple examples from Hiram and Joseph of like, hey, let's be kind to animals and let's not kill them unless we absolutely need them and things like that. Hiram also said the following. God has appointed the word of wisdom as one of the engines to bring about this thing, to remove the beastly appetites, the murderous disposition, and the vitiated taste of man, to restore his body to health and vigor, promote peace between him and the brute creation. So here, Hiram is explaining that the word of wisdom, in part, is designed to basically subdue man's carnal tendencies to kill animals for their flesh and to consume them, to deter that behavior, to diminish the frequency with which men are killing animals, in order to what? To promote peace between man and the brute creation, as he calls it. Kind of interesting that he's implying kind of a purpose that isn't apparent from the text itself, but Hiram is saying, here's why I think this was given. So why don't more Latter-day Saints eat meat sparingly? I mean, I think you could argue it's the traditions of our fathers, right? Like, we've grown up in a meat-saturated culture. Meat's abundant. It's available. It's in every, fast food joint. It's the basic staple of a dinner meal. It's very kind of culturally accepted. We've grown up in that environment. There's been a lack of clarity from church leaders. There's been a lack of specificity about what does it mean to be sparing, and what does that comma mean, and what is times of cold and famine and winter, and how do we better define this so that we live it? Let's talk about it. Let's get clarification. And yet we don't have any. Therefore, the saints are just kind of like, that burger looks good. Let me go eat, right? And without any concerted effort to clarify and standardize and seek additional revelation, right, we opt for the traditions of our fathers. It's interesting then that in verse 3 of the word of wisdom, it says that this principle was adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints. So if eating meat sparingly was adapted for the weak, kind of makes you wonder, like, what's the higher law? Maybe there is or isn't one on this topic of meat. I should also point out, though, that verse 3 was not in God's revelation. The word of wisdom actually begins from the Lord in verse 4. Verses 1 through 3 were added by the editors when they were compiling it for inclusion in the Doctrine and Covenants. So that idea that this was adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints is commentary. It's not part of the revelation itself. It's also important, I think, to point out and reiterate that the word of wisdom was given, quote, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days. That is from the word of wisdom itself. So how might that relate to meat? I mean, one idea perhaps is the profit motive, right? Like, there's, as I mentioned earlier, this like industrial operation. There's just this massive sea change in how animals are raised and slaughtered. I briefly considered showing a clip of a video I've seen, and there's all kinds on the internet of what these operations look like, where even like chicks when they're born are quickly identified for gender, and the males are kind of put in this grinder and just immediately killed and ground up for whatever other purposes that that flesh can be used for, because they only want the female chicks to then go on to lay eggs and so forth. So, I opted not to share some of the kind of brutal, squeamish type of stuff, but the reality is that it exists, and animals are raised and slaughtered in abundant quantity. You might also say in diminished quality as well, changing the meat, the type of meat, the preservatives, the whatever, right? So like in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, you could say, like, some of that has to do with how our food is being produced and what's in it and the quality of it and the hormones and all the things, right? I also thought it was interesting. I was like, well, Jesus ate fish. So how does, if this is like a higher, better law, not just for like Latter-day Saints, but like if this was intended for like godly people throughout time somehow to operate by, because then I'm like, all right, well, in pre-modern societies, they often didn't have sufficient nutrients from other sources. Effectively, there was kind of a famine, therefore meat was okay. Like, but again, like Jesus was living in the culture of his time, and a culture that was not being given this word of wisdom in particular. You could also argue that in our modern era, despite there being an abundance of food options, many people are in a state of famine because their bodies are are deprived of nutrients, right? They're eating junk. They're eating unhealthy foods full of chemicals and preservatives and food dyes and whatever. Like, you could argue that those people need meat because they themselves, despite eating a lot and having a caloric intake in excess of what they ought, are still in famine. That's kind of an interesting thought. It's not just like there's no food anywhere. It's that you're not getting the nutrients that you need. So, excuse me, is that what it could mean, or could include when it says times of famine? I don't know. And here I sit as a lifelong member of the church. I am a meat-eating member of the church. I had a delicious barbecue a few weeks ago. I'm going to be having some turkey on Thanksgiving, and so here I sit as a meat-eating lifelong member of the church, and I don't remember my predilection for meat as a youth, as a missionary, as a BYU student, as a whatever, all my callings, all my life, years of membership. I don't remember ever being challenged on my consumption of meat, or being asked to review, like, is this in line with the word of wisdom? I don't remember any planning committee when I was on ward council or helping with events or family home evening at BYU, like, talking about what food we're going to have, where we're going to go eat. Like, I don't remember the meat issue ever coming up. I don't remember anyone ever objecting or raising a question even for discussion about whether, that consumption of meat was in harmony with the word of wisdom. I don't remember any leader, when talking about the temple recommend questions and the word of wisdom, or even any gospel doctrine lesson, everyone just kind of like glosses over it. If we even read the verses, if the manual even like highlights them for attention, we just breeze past them, right? Because we all eat meat, unless you're like vegetarian or vegan or whatever for other reasons. But I would say, like, I couldn't even quantify what minute percent of church members have diminished their meat consumption to be truly sparing only in times of famine or cold or winter or whatever those actually mean, because of the word of wisdom. Like, I think it's just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. So it's very interesting to me, again, going back to that selective obedience idea. It's like the verses on consecration or secret combinations or whatever, right? It's like, oh, we just skip over those, Oh yeah, the church of the devil and corruption of modern churches, and no, I'm just gonna skip over that. Right, nothing to see here. Keep the blinders on. Let's focus on the easy stuff. So it's interesting to me to dig into this topic as I did this past week, to reflect for myself, what does it mean to eat sparingly? What does times of cold or famine or winter mean? How do I contextualize that? And how do I try and live the word of wisdom, not just the selective, narrow interpretation but like, if there are kind of these blessings attached and these opportunities, I think it's worth reflecting and saying, is my meat consumption or broader consumption in harmony with what the Lord says? It's very interesting, especially when you look at it in a particular cultural context at the time. To what extent did kind of the temperance movement and some of these things affect Joseph's thinking and the words that kind of entered his mind and so forth? Like, maybe not. So it's interesting from a cultural perspective, but it's also interesting from a modern cultural perspective of like how those verses are just kind of completely ignored and sent down the memory hole. And none of us judge our righteousness based on whether we go to a barbecue or not. Like, you can kind of shame someone for being in the drive-thru at Starbucks and they're a member of your ward, and you're like, oh, like that has a cultural stigma to it. But seeing them at like some barbecue joint down the road, statistically 0% of Latter-day Saints will have any thought enter their mind as to the righteousness and the worthiness of that Latter-day Saint who's in a barbecue joint. Because they themselves, we all, again, unless you're vegetarian or vegan, are doing this. And again, myself, I've never been challenged. No one ever pushed back. No one ever raised the question for discussion. Later in life, when I realized, oh wait, these verses are in there and we should actually, like, what do they actually mean, rather than like just ignoring them and glossing over them. So what do you think? I am curious, are there examples that you have? Have you ever seen or heard of that comma issue before, especially pre-1921? Again, if anyone out there has knowledge or evidence of anyone talking about it before, I would love it, because everyone I saw was talking about 1921. So let me know in the comments. What do you think? How do you interpret this? Is it a double standard for Latter-day Saints to fixate on certain portions of the Word of Wisdom or broadly other scriptures when we completely like just ignore some of the ones that are like confusing or inconvenient or countercultural or too hard? Oh, it would be too hard to give up meat. I love meat, like stuff like that, right? So I am here to say that, again, I am a meat-eating Latter-day Saint. I do want to reflect what sparingly means. I remain confused about what times of cold and winter and famine are. I didn't go off into the branches of all those sub-arguments because there's tons of arguments and then responses to those, and I just thought that was kind of a distraction. Needless to say, I don't think it's as simplistic of saying, oh, well, truly, like from the months of November to February, it's okay. Or hey, because we have, modern refrigeration, it now doesn't apply at all. Or it does apply every month of the year because, we have abundance of plants and all kinds of other things from which to get our nutrients. Like there's all kinds of just little rabbit holes to go down to go down. And any argument you want to make, there will be supporting arguments to justify it. If the outcome that you desire of this is like, I'm fine to go to a barbecue once every other week and have, get a Costco chicken and get burgers, once a week, blah, 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 blah. Like if that's what you feel comfortable with and feel is justified, then there will be arguments to support that. There's clearly an abundance of differing interpretations here, and lacking any of that clarity from leaders of the church. It's left up to everyone to decide on their own, and there are quite diverging interpretations. I'm curious what yours are. Did I miss any? Did I fail to include a perspective that you have, how you interpret this? Are these verses something that we should even care about? Or do they go down the memory hole because we're just waiting for further light and knowledge, and until we get it, it's confusing enough to ignore? I don't know. Let me know what you think. I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you next week.